All right, here's the first part of our lesson, 13.2. In this lesson, we're going to be talking just about absolute value functions. So we're not going to be talking about transformations quite yet. We'll talk about that together in class tomorrow. So really what I want us to do today is just understand, what does an absolute value function look like? So an absolute value function is defined by a piecewise function in that it has two different parts. So the basic definition of an absolute value function is this piecewise function right here. And what this function says is that when x's are positive, so remember our second part always helps us to color code. So when x's are positive, then it just equals x. All right, so that means for these parts greater than or equal to 0, that's these parts of my table. So if I go ahead and plug that in, that means for this section of my table, I'm just using the function f of x equals x. So I'm just plugging in, this is f of 0, so that's going to equal 0. F of 1 will equal 1. F of 2 will equal 2, and they already told us f of 3 equaled 3. All right, if we go back to our color coding, it says if x is less than 0, so that's these up here, then my function is negative x. All right, so if I write that out, that means for this part of the table, I have f of x equals, and yesterday you all liked to say negative 1x. You thought that was a little easier to make sense of. So that means if I want to find negative 2, I'm going to do negative 1 times negative 2, which is positive 2. Up here, they did negative 1 and plugged in negative 3 and got positive 3. If I plug in negative 1, I'm going to get positive 1. All right, so these are your table of values for your parent absolute function. Remember, this is the parent function. It's the most basic. So you may want to label this as the most basic absolute value function. All right, so let's take a second and go ahead and plot these points and see what our absolute value function looks like. So notice that I'm counting by 2's here. So at negative 3, we have the point 3, negative 2, 2, negative 1, 1. All right, those are all my points for the blue function. And if you notice, those are going to, it's going to be open, open there on 0, and it's just going to go up like this if I connect them. And then my red function will be right here, 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3. You see that pattern, that one's going to go up this way. So what you may recognize now is that right now the absolute value function looks like a V. All right, notice that that looks like just a big V. All right, so our parent absolute value function, I would maybe make a note to yourself that absolute value looks like a V. We're going to have different shaped functions as we go throughout algebra. So absolute value has a V-shaped graph. V-shaped graph. And then some parts about the graph that you need to know. This middle point right here is in the parent function, it's on 0, 0. It's called the vertex. And then you may recognize that the slope here is 1 over 1, right? Up 1 over 1. All right, so what I have written down, though, are the biggest things that you need to note right now about the graph. Okay, the last thing we're going to make a note of is the domain and range. So remember that domain are your x values. So domain are always going to be your x values. And here, these arrows are pointing out forever. So if I'm going out in both directions forever, that means my domain is going to be all real numbers. And we have a few ways to note that. We can use the capital R, that means all real numbers, or we could say negative infinity to positive infinity. That's another way to write that. Actually, we'll make that one more better. Let's do negative infinity to positive infinity. This is that same inequality notation that we used yesterday when we were writing our piecewise functions. All right, so there's our domain. And then our range, these are my y values. And if you think about this, the y values, you can even look in the table, right? So if you look up here in your table, my y values, the lowest they could ever be is 0, and then they just go up forever. You could even think about these arrows on the ends of my functions are going up forever. So if I think about it that way, since they're going up forever, that's going to mean that my range is y greater than or equal to 0. Okay, so that's all we have for today. You just need to know what the most basic absolute value function looks like. You should probably have the table at the top in your notes, just so that you remember why it's a piecewise function and how that works. And then you need to understand domain and range for this part. So come to class tomorrow with specific questions on maybe what you don't understand about this before we use this to go a step further.